A senior Russian lawmaker has called for military strikes against United States naval vessels. Alexei Zhuravlyov, first deputy head of the State Duma Defense Committee, has publicly called for Russia to attack U.S. Coast Guard ships with torpedoes, to sink them. The call came in response to the American seizure of the Russian-flagged oil tanker Marinera in the North Atlantic on Wednesday. Speaking to the Russian outlet Podium, Zhuravlyov did not mince words. "Attack with torpedoes. Sink a couple of American Coast Guard boats," he said. "They are guarding their shore normally, several thousand kilometers away from it. I think the United States, which is in a kind of euphoria of impunity after the special operation in Venezuela, can only be stopped with such a click on the nose." A click on the nose. That is how a senior member of Russia's parliament describes potentially killing American sailors. A wake-up call, a slap on the wrist, sink their ships, kill their people, that will teach them. This is where we are now. Zhuravlyov framed the American seizure in the starkest possible terms. "This is ordinary piracy," he declared. "The seizure of a civilian vessel by the armed American fleet. In essence, it is the same thing as an attack on Russian territory, because the tanker was sailing under our state flag. Under international maritime law, a vessel flying a nation's flag is considered an extension of that nation's territory. When the Marinera flew the Russian flag, it was, in Moscow's view, a piece of Russia floating on the high seas. And the United States boarded it by force, seized it, took it. For Russia, this is not merely a sanctions enforcement action. It is, in Zhuravlyov's telling, an act of war, an attack on Russian sovereignty, and he believes it demands a military response." Zhuravlyov went further. He invoked Russia's military doctrine. "Responding to this, without any doubt, must be done harshly and promptly," he said. "Our military doctrine in response to such actions even allows for the use of nuclear weapons." Nuclear weapons! Over an oil tanker. Now, to be clear, Zhuravlyov is not saying Russia should launch nuclear strikes. He is pointing out that under Russia's stated military doctrine, an attack on Russian territory, which he argues this was, could theoretically justify a nuclear response. It is a reminder, a threat, a signal. Russia wants the world to know that it considers this seizure to be an act of aggression, and that all options, including the most extreme, are technically on the table. Whether this is genuine threat or political theater is an open question, but the language itself represents a dramatic escalation. Zhuravlyov also revealed, or claimed, something significant. Russian military assets were in the vicinity when the seizure occurred. According to available information, somewhere near the vessel was a Russian submarine and also some of our other military ships, he said. This aligns with earlier reports. Reuters reported that a Russian submarine and warship were in the area as American forces boarded the Marinera. Yet Russia did not intervene. The submarine did not surface to challenge the boarding. The warship did not maneuver to block the operation. Russian military forces watched as American commandos seized a Russian-flagged vessel and did nothing. For Zhuravlyov, this is apparently unacceptable. He wants Russia to act, to respond, to strike. But the fact that Russian forces were present and chose not to intervene tells its own story. Let us review what happened. The Marinera, originally known as the Bella One, is an oil tanker that had been sanctioned by the United States. Washington alleged the vessel was part of the so-called Shadow Fleet, a network of ships that carry oil for sanctioned countries like Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. The U.S. further alleged that the Marinera had smuggled cargo for a company linked to Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant group designated as a terrorist organization by Washington. In late December, as the tanker attempted to reach Venezuela, the U.S. Coast Guard tried to board it in the Caribbean. The Marinera refused. It fled. The vessel turned east and raced across the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles, trying to escape American pursuit. For weeks, U.S. Coast Guard cutters and military assets tracked the tanker. There was reportedly at least one previous attempt to seize it during a storm. The Marinera even changed its name and repainted its hull in a desperate attempt to evade capture. It switched to a Russian flag on December 24th, just weeks before the seizure, apparently hoping Russian registration would provide protection. It did not. On Wednesday, as the Marinera neared Iceland's exclusive economic zone, American forces struck. In a pre-dawn operation, U.S. Coast Guard and military personnel boarded the vessel from helicopters. The seizure was complete. The Marinera was now in American hands. The Marinera was not the only vessel seized that day. Hours later, American forces captured a second tanker, the M. Sophia. The M. Sophia was a Panama-flagged vessel under U.S. sanctions. It had departed Venezuelan waters earlier in January as part of a fleet carrying Venezuelan oil to China. The vessel was operating in dark mode, its transponder turned off to avoid satellite tracking. A classic shadow fleet tactic. It did not work. American surveillance, satellites, aircraft, ships, intelligence networks tracked the M. Sophia despite its attempts to disappear, and they seized it. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem announced the capture, noting that both the M. Sophia and the Marinera were either last docked in Venezuela or en route to it. 2 tankers, 2 seizures, 1 day. The message was unmistakable. The United States is hunting the shadow fleet. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made the American position explicit. The blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect, anywhere in the world, he declared. Anywhere in the world. The United States is asserting the right to seize vessels in international waters, thousands of miles from American territory, for violating American sanctions. Not United Nations sanctions, not internationally agreed restrictions. American sanctions. Washington is saying, our laws apply everywhere. Our enforcement reaches everywhere. No ship carrying sanctioned oil is safe, no matter where it sails. For Russia, this is an intolerable assertion of American hegemony. For the United States, it is simply enforcing the rules. The two perspectives cannot be reconciled. The Russian government responded with fury, though not so far, with torpedoes. The Russian Transport Ministry condemned the seizure as a violation of international maritime law. In accordance with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, freedom of navigation applies in the high seas, the ministry stated. No state has the right to use force against vessels duly registered in the jurisdictions of other states. Russia argued that the Marinera was in international waters, flying a recognized flag, engaged in peaceful commerce. Under the principle of flag state jurisdiction, which has governed maritime law for centuries, ships on the high seas are subject only to the laws of the country whose flag they fly. Other nations cannot board, seize, or interfere with their passage. The United States, Russia argued, violated this fundamental principle. The Transport Ministry added that contact with the vessel was lost after U.S. naval forces boarded it in the open sea, beyond the territorial waters of any state. The Russian Foreign Ministry had been critical of the American pursuit even before the seizure. For reasons unclear to us, the Russian vessel is receiving heightened attention from U.S. and NATO militaries, the ministry had said. Attention clearly disproportionate to its peaceful status. Russia characterized the Marinera as a civilian vessel engaged in legitimate commerce. The United States characterized it as a sanctions-busting ship, part of a shadow fleet, linked to terrorist financing, a threat to national security. These narratives cannot be reconciled. For Russia, the seizure is piracy, a powerful nation using military force to steal a ship on the high seas. For the United States, it is law enforcement, bringing a criminal vessel to justice. And now a senior Russian lawmaker is calling for torpedo attacks in response. Who is Alexei Zhuravlyov? He is the first deputy head of the State Duma's Defense Committee. The State Duma is Russia's parliament, the lower house of the Federal Assembly. The Defense Committee oversees military affairs, defense policy, and national security matters. As first deputy head, Zhuravlyov is a senior figure, not the most powerful, but not a backbencher either. He is a member of the nationalist Rodina party. He has a history of provocative statements. His views do not necessarily represent official Kremlin policy, but his position gives his words weight. When a senior member of Russia's parliament, especially one on the Defense Committee, calls for military attacks on American vessels, it matters. Even if the Kremlin does not formally endorse the statement, it signals the mood within certain circles of the Russian government. Is Zhuravlyov's statement a genuine threat or political theater? The answer is probably both. Russian politicians, like politicians everywhere, sometimes make inflammatory statements for domestic consumption. Calling for torpedo attacks on American ships plays well with nationalist audiences. It signals strength, defiance, a willingness to stand up to the United States. But the actual likelihood that Russia will torpedo American Coast Guard vessels is extremely low. Such an action would trigger an immediate military response from the United States. It would likely lead to direct conflict between two nuclear-armed powers. It would risk escalation to a broader war. A war Russia is already stretched thin fighting in Ukraine. The Russian military knows this. The Kremlin knows this. Zhuravlyov almost certainly knows this. His statement is designed to signal Russian anger, to establish that Moscow considers the seizure an act of aggression, and to raise the rhetorical stakes. Whether it is designed to actually guide Russian military action is another question entirely. The most telling detail in this entire affair may be what did not happen. Russian military assets, a submarine, a warship, were reportedly in the vicinity of the Marinera when American forces boarded it. They did not intervene. They did not fire. They did not attempt to block the operation. They watched. Why? Several possibilities. First, Russia may have calculated that direct confrontation with American forces was too risky. A submarine surfacing to challenge a Coast Guard cutter could escalate rapidly. A warship maneuvering to block a boarding operation could lead to shots fired, casualties, war. For a single tanker, however symbolically important, that risk may have been deemed too high. Second, Russia may have lacked the capability to intervene effectively. The Atlantic is far from Russian bases. American naval superiority in these waters is overwhelming. Even with assets present, Russia may not have had the force necessary to stop the operation without being destroyed in the process. Third, Russia may have chosen to lose the battle to win the war by allowing the seizure to happen and then condemning it loudly. Moscow gets to play the victim on the world stage. It can point to American piracy and aggression without having fired a shot. It can rally international sympathy without risking military defeat. Whatever the reason, Russian forces were present and did not act. Zhuravlyov's calls for torpedo attacks ring hollow against that reality. Zhuravlyov explicitly connected the tanker seizure to the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The United States, which is in a kind of euphoria of impunity after the special operation in Venezuela, can only be stopped with such a click on the nose, he said. The Venezuela operation clearly rattled Moscow. Maduro was a Russian ally. Venezuela has been a partner in sanctions evasion, arms deals, and anti-American solidarity. And American forces simply flew in and took him, seized a sitting president, flew him to Brooklyn to face trial. For Russia, the message is alarming. If the United States can reach into Caracas and capture Maduro, what else can it do? If American forces can board Russian-flagged vessels in the middle of the Atlantic, where are the limits? The seizures of Maduro, of tankers, of anything Washington deems a threat, demonstrate an American willingness to project power that Russia finds deeply threatening. Zhuravlyov's response is to call for military action, to show that Russia will not be pushed around, to demonstrate that there are consequences for American impunity. But so far, his calls have not been backed by action. Let us be blunt about the military realities. If Russia were to torpedo American Coast Guard vessels, the United States would respond. And that response would be devastating. The U.S. Navy is the most powerful naval force in the world. It operates 11 aircraft carriers. More are under construction. It has dozens of nuclear-powered submarines, attack submarines, ballistic missile submarines, guided missile submarines. Its surface fleet includes cruisers, destroyers, and frigates armed with the most advanced weapon systems on the planet. Russia's Navy is capable, but it is not in the same league. Years of underinvestment, the loss of Soviet-era shipyards in Ukraine, and the demands of the war on land have all taken their toll. In a direct naval confrontation in the Atlantic, the outcome would not be in doubt. American forces would prevail. Russian ships that fired on American vessels would be sunk. Russian bases that supported those ships could be struck. The escalation ladder from there leads to places no one wants to go. Zhuravlyov may call for torpedo attacks, but the Russian military knows what would follow. The danger is not that Russia will deliberately start a war over an oil tanker. The danger is miscalculation. What if a Russian submarine commander, emboldened by rhetoric from politicians like Zhuravlyov, decides to act on his own initiative? What if an American vessel and a Russian vessel have a confrontation that spirals out of control? What if a warning shot is misinterpreted? What if communications fail? What if someone makes a mistake? Wars have started over less. World War I began with an assassination. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, later revealed to be far more ambiguous than initially reported, led to American escalation in Vietnam. When military forces from rival powers operate in close proximity, with tensions high and politicians calling for blood, the risk of unintended escalation is real. The Russian military assets near the Marinera did not fire, but they were there. American forces were there. The potential for a spark exists. The seizure raises profound questions about international law. Russia argues that the United States violated the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a treaty that, notably, the United States has never ratified. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, ships on the high seas are subject to the jurisdiction of their flag state. Other nations cannot board or seize them. The principle of freedom of navigation has governed maritime commerce for centuries. The United States argues that sanctions enforcement can supersede these traditional protections. Ships engaged in illicit activity, violating sanctions, supporting terrorism, threatening national security, forfeit their protection under international law. Washington has the power to enforce this interpretation. Whether it has the legal right is contested. For advocates of a rules-based international order, the seizure is troubling, even for those who support sanctions on Venezuela and Russia. If powerful nations can seize ships in international waters based on their own unilateral sanctions, what does freedom of navigation mean? If American law can be enforced anywhere in the world, regardless of other nations' objections, what role does international law play? These are uncomfortable questions, and they do not have easy answers. The seizures of the Marinera and Sophia are part of a broader campaign. The Trump administration has made dismantling the shadow fleet a priority. These vessels, dozens, perhaps hundreds of ships, carry oil for sanctioned countries. They operate outside normal shipping channels. They sail with transponders off. They transfer cargo at sea. They use falsified documents, change names, switch flags. For Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, the shadow fleet is a lifeline. Without it, they struggle to sell their oil on international markets. Without oil revenue, their governments cannot fund operations, pay soldiers, or maintain power. The American seizures send a message to every ship in the shadow fleet: you are not safe. The US is watching, tracking, pursuing, and it will catch you. For shipping companies, the calculus has changed. Is the risk worth the profit? For insurers, similar questions. Will they cover vessels engaged in sanctions evasion? For flag states like Panama, which registered the Sophia, the questions are pointed. What protection can a flag state actually provide when the United States decides to seize a vessel? The answer apparently, not much. Russia faces a genuine dilemma. A vessel flying its flag was boarded by American forces in international waters. Russian military assets were present and did not intervene. Moscow has condemned the seizure in the strongest diplomatic terms, but it has not taken military action. Zhuravlyov calls for torpedoes. The Kremlin has not endorsed that call. Why? Because Russia knows the consequences. Direct military confrontation with the United States is not in Russia's interest. Russia is already fighting a war in Ukraine, a war that has consumed resources, manpower, and attention. Opening a second front against the world's most powerful military would be catastrophic. So Russia is left with rhetoric, strong words, condemnations, threats that stop short of action. It is not a satisfying position for a nation that views itself as a great power, but it may be the only realistic option. The tanker seizures fit a broader pattern. Since returning to office, President Trump has demonstrated a willingness to use American military power aggressively. The capture of Maduro was the most dramatic example, a military operation to seize a sitting head of state, an action without modern precedent. The tanker seizures extend that pattern. American forces pursuing vessels across oceans, boarding them by force, seizing cargo and ships. The message to the world is clear. The United States is willing to act, unilaterally if necessary, regardless of what other nations think, regardless of international law objections. America has the power, and it is using it. For allies, this may be reassuring. For adversaries, it is alarming. For neutral observers, it raises questions about the stability of the international order. The question now is what comes next. Will Russia escalate? Zhuravlyov's calls for torpedo attacks suggest some within the Russian government want escalation. But the Kremlin has not endorsed military action. Russian forces in the Atlantic did not intervene during the seizure. Moscow appears to be accepting, grudgingly, that it cannot match American naval power in these waters. The alternative is to accept what Zhuravlyov calls euphoria of impunity. To watch as America seizes Russian-flagged vessels and does nothing. For a nation that prides itself on standing up to Western power, this is humiliating. But humiliation may be preferable to destruction. Russia can condemn, it can threaten, it can make noise. But unless it is prepared to risk direct military confrontation with the United States, there may be little it can actually do. And the seizures must be understood in the context of Venezuela. The Marinera and M. Sofia were both connected to Venezuelan oil trade. With Maduro captured and the Venezuelan government under siege, the Trump administration is moving to control the country's most valuable resource. If Venezuela cannot export oil, it cannot generate revenue. If it cannot generate revenue, it cannot fund the government. If it cannot fund the government, resistance to American demands becomes increasingly difficult. The tanker seizures are economic warfare by other means. Choke off the oil, strangle the revenue, force submission. Russia, which has its own interests in Venezuelan oil and its own reasons to oppose American sanctions, finds itself unable to protect even ships flying its flag. It is a demonstration of American reach and Russian limitations. We are in a dangerous moment. American forces are seizing ships in international waters. Russian politicians are calling for military attacks on American vessels. Both sides are testing limits, probing boundaries, seeing what they can get away with. Deterrence works only when both sides believe the other will act. The United States has demonstrated it will act against Maduro, against tankers, against anyone who defies American demands. Russia has demonstrated it will not act, at least not militarily, at least not yet. That asymmetry creates risks. If Russia concludes it cannot deter American actions, it may become desperate. Desperate nations do dangerous things. If the United States concludes Russia will never respond, it may push further. Further pushes may eventually cross a line that even a cautious Russia cannot tolerate. The dance between deterrence and escalation is delicate. One misstep can change everything. The world is watching. The seizure of the Marinera is not just about one tanker. It is about the rules that govern international commerce. It is about the limits of American power. It is about whether Russia can protect its interests and its flag on the high seas. It is about whether the Shadow Fleet can survive American interdiction. It is about whether nations under U.S. sanctions have any options beyond submission. These questions will not be answered by one seizure or one inflammatory statement from a Russian politician. They will be answered over time, through actions and reactions, through calculations and miscalculations. But the trajectory is clear. Great power competition has returned to the seas, and the consequences may be profound. Alexei Zhuravlyov wants Russia to give the United States a click on the nose, to sink Coast Guard boats, to kill American sailors, to teach Washington a lesson. Will it happen? Almost certainly not. The risks are too high, the consequences too severe, the military balance too unfavorable. But Zhuravlyov's words matter. They signal the anger within Russian political circles. They establish a rhetorical baseline for future escalation. They remind the world that not everyone in Moscow is willing to accept American dominance passively. And they raise the temperature, incrementally, dangerously, in an already volatile situation. Today, the tanker seizures are a diplomatic crisis. Tomorrow, if rhetoric like Zhuravlyov's translates into action, they could be something far worse. The world watches and waits.